Chapter 2. They would be in Raccoon City in just under an hour. Nikolai was prepared, and he believed his squad would do well. Better than the rest, anyway. The 9 others that made up Squad B respected him. He had seen it in their eyes, and although they would almost certainly die, their performance would be noteworthy. After all, he had practically trained them on himself. There was no talking in the helicopter that carried Platoon D through the late afternoon, not even among the squad leaders, the only personnel who wore headsets. It was too loud for the troops to hear one another, and Nikolai had nothing to say to either Hitrami or Cryan, or Mikhail Victor for that matter. Victor was their superior, the commander of the entire platoon. It was a job that should have belonged to Nikolai. Victor lacked the qualities that made up a true leader. I possess them, though. I was chosen for Watchdog, and when this is all over, I'm the one Umbrella will have to deal with, whether they like it or not. Nikolai kept his face a stone, but he smiled inside. When the time came, they, the men who controlled Umbrella, from behind the scenes, would realize that they'd underestimated him. He sat near the A and C squad leaders against one wall of the cabin, soothed by the steady and familiar throb of the transport. The very air was charged with tension and heavy with the scent of masculine sweat, again familiar. He had led men into battle before, although if everything went as planned, he would never have to again. He let his gaze wander over the taut faces of the troops, wondering if any of them would survive more than an hour or two. It was possible, he supposed. There was the scared man from the South Africa in Cryan's group, and on his own squad, John Rabowski, who had taken part in an ethnic cleansing a few years back. Nikolai couldn't remember which one. Both men had the combination of deep suspicion and self-possession that might conceivably allow them to escape Raccoon, however unlikely, and it was unlikely. The briefing hadn't prepared any of them for what was ahead. Nikolai's own private briefing 2 days earlier had been a different matter. Operation Watchdog, they called it. He knew the projected numbers, and been told what to expect and how to most effectively dispatch the unclean, the walking diseased. They told him about the tyrant-like seeker units that were going to be sent in, and how to avoid them. He knew more than anyone on the transport. But I'm also readier than Umbrella can possibly imagine, because I know the names of the other dogs. Again, he suppressed a smile. He possessed additional information that Umbrella didn't know he had. That was worth a great deal of money, or would be, soon enough. On the surface, the UBCS was being sent in to rescue civilians. That was what they'd been told anyway. But he was one of the 10 who'd been chosen to gather and record data on the T-virus carriers, humans and otherwise, and how they fared against trained soldiers. The real reason the UBCS were being sent in, aka Watchdog, in the helicopter that carried Platoon A were 2 others, disguised as UBCS. There were 6 already planted in Raccoon, 3 scientists, 2 Umbrella paper pushers, and a woman that worked for the city. The 10th was a police officer, a personal assistant to the chief himself. Each of them probably knew 1 or 2 of the others that Umbrella had handpicked as information collectors, but thanks to his well-developed computer skills and a few borrowed passwords, he was the only one who knew about all of them, as well as where each was supposed to be to file their reports. Wouldn't their contacts be surprised when they failed to report in? Wouldn't it be amusing if only one watchdog survived and was able to name his price for the information that had been gathered? And wasn't it amazing to think that a man could become a multimillionaire if he was willing to expend thought, a bit of effort, and a few bullets? 9 people. He was 9 people away from being the only Umbrella employee to have the information they wanted. Most, if not all, of the UBCS would die quickly, and then he'd be free to find the other watchdogs, to take their data and end their miserable lives. This time he couldn't help it. Nikolai grinned. The mission that had lay ahead promised to be an exciting one, a true test of his many skills. And when it was over, he was going to be a very wealthy man. In spite of the cramped seating and the dull roar of the copter's engines, Carlos was only faintly aware of his surroundings. He couldn't get his mind off of Trent and the decidedly weird conversation they had a couple hours ago, and he found that he kept replaying it, trying to decide if any of it was useful. To begin with, Carlos had trusted the guy about as far as he could toss him. The man had been way too happy. Not outwardly so much, but Carlos had gotten the definite impression that Trent was laughing about something just beneath the surface. His dark eyes had fairly danced with humor, and he told Carlos that he had information for him, stepping back into the alley he emerged from as if there had been no question Carlos would follow. There hadn't been, really. Carlos had learned to be very careful in this line of work, but he also knew a few things about reading people. And Trent, though obviously strange, hadn't been particularly threatening. The alley had been cool and dark and had smelled faintly of urine. What kind of information, Carlos had asked? Trent had acted as though he hadn't heard the question. In the shopping district downtown, you'll find a diner called Grill 13. It's just up the street from the fountain and right next to the theater. You can't miss it. If you can manage to get there by, he glanced at his watch, say 1900 hours, I'll see what can be done to help you. Carlos hadn't even known where to start. Hey, no offense, but what the hell are you talking about? Trent had smiled. Raccoon City. It's where you're going. Carlos had stared at him, waiting for more, but Trent had seemed to be finished. God knows how he got my name, but this baddo ain't playing with a full deck. Listen, Mr. Trent. Just Trent. He cut in, still smiling. Carlos had started to get irritated. Whatever. I think you might have the wrong Oliviera. And while I appreciate your concern, I really got to get going. Ah, yes, duty calls, Trent had said, his smile fading. Understand, they won't tell you all you need to know. It will be far, far worse. The hours ahead may be dark ones, Mr. Oliviera, but I have faith in your abilities. Just remember, Grill 13, 7 o'clock, northeast corner of the city proper. Yeah, sure, Carlos had said, nodding, backing away into the daylight, wearing a somewhat forced grin on his own. Good deal. I'll make a note of it. Trent had smiled again, stepping out after him. Be very careful who you trust, Mr. Oliviera, and good luck. Carlos had turned and started to walk quickly away. Throwing a glance back at Trent, the man had watched him, hands in his pockets again, his stance casual and relaxed. For a nutbag, he sure didn't seem crazy. And he seems a lot less crazy now, eh? Carlos had still made it to the office a little early, but nobody seemed to have heard anything off the grapevine about what was up. At the short briefing presented by the UBCS platoon leaders, they had all been told what few facts there were. A toxic chemical spill had occurred earlier in the week in an isolated community, causing hallucinations that bred violence. The chemicals had dissipated, but regular civilians continued to be harassed by those who'd been affected. There was evidence that the damage could be permanent, and the local police hadn't been able to get things under control. The UBCS was being sent in to help evacuate the citizens who had been affected, and to use force, if necessary, to protect them from harm. Top secret all the way. In Raccoon City, which meant that maybe Trent knew something after all. And what did that mean? If he was right about where we're going, what about the rest of it? What didn't they tell us that we need to know? And what could possibly be far, far worse than a mob of deranged and violent people? He didn't know, and he didn't like not knowing. He'd first picked up a gun at the age of 12 to help defend his family from a band of terrorists, and had gone pro at 17. For 4 years now, he'd been paid to put his life in danger for one cause or another, but he'd always known what the stakes were and what he was up against. This was not at all cool. The thought of going in blind, the only consolation was that he was going in with over 100 experienced soldiers. Whatever it was, they'd be able to handle it. Carlos looked around, thinking that he was with a good group. Not good men, necessarily, but adept fighters. Way more important in combat. They even looked ready, their eyes hard and watchful, their faces determined, except for the B squad leader, who was staring off into space and grinning like a shark, like a predator. Carlos was suddenly uneasy, looking at the guy, Nikolai something or other, cropped white hair, built like a weightlifter. He'd never seen anyone smile quite like that. The Russian met his gaze, and his grin widened for just a moment in a way that made Carlos want to sit with his back to a wall and a gun in his hand. And then the moment was over, and Nikolai nodded absently at him and looked away. Just another soldier acknowledging a comrade. Nothing more. He was being paranoid. That meeting with Trent had him on edge, and he was always a little sketchy before a fight. Grill 13, next to the theater. He wouldn't forget, just in case. Chapter 3. Jill's plan was to skirt the town to the southeast, sticking to side streets and cutting through buildings as much as possible. The main streets weren't safe, and many of them had been blocked off in an attempt to corral the zombies before things got too bad. If she could make it far enough south, she should be able to cut across farmland to Route 71, one of the feeders to the main highway. So far, so good. At this rate, I'll make it to 71 before it gets completely dark. It had taken less than an hour to make it from the suburbs to the apparently empty apartment building where she now stood, shivering a little from the damp chill that pervaded the poorly lit hallway. She dressed for ease of movement rather than protection from the elements. A tight shirt, a mini skirt, and boots, as well as a fanny pack to hold extra magazines. The body-hugging outfit clung to her like a second skin and would allow her to move quickly. She'd also brought a plain white sweatshirt for when she made it out of the city, which she now wore tied around her waist for the time being. She'd rather suffer the chill and have her arms free. The Imperial was a slightly run-down apartment building at the southern edge of uptown Raccoon. Jill had discovered from her earlier excursions that once infected, the T-virus zombies went in search of food as soon as they could, abandoning their homes and taking to the streets. Not all of them, of course, but enough so that cutting through buildings was generally safer than being out in the open. A noise, a soft moan coming from behind one of the apartment doors farther down the hall. Jill froze, gun in hand, straining to hear which side it came from, and realized in the same moment that she could smell gas. "Shit," she whispered, trying to recall the layout of the building as the oily, pungent scent filled her nostrils. A right turn where the corridor T'd ahead and another right? Or is it the lobby right there? Think. You were here 2 days ago. Jesus, that's gotta be a massive leak. There was another groan from up ahead, definitely coming from the apartment on the left. It was the mindless, empty sound that the zombies made, the only sound that they could make as far as she knew. The door was cracked open, and Jill almost imagined she could see the shimmering waves as gas-thicked air pouring out into the hall. She gripped the Beretta tighter and took a step backwards. She'd have to go back the way she'd come. She didn't dare risk firing, and she didn't particularly want to fend off one of the carriers bare-handed. A single bite from one of them would pass the infection on to her. Another step backwards and creak. Jill spun around, instinctively raising her weapon as the door swung open perhaps 5 meters back. A shuffling, stoop-shouldered man lurched out into the gloom, cutting her off from the back entrance. He had the sallow skin and the dead eyes of a virus carrier, as if the fact that one of his cheeks had been ripped off wasn't proof enough. Zombies felt no pain. As this one opened its mouth to moan hungrily at her, she could see the base of its gray, swollen tongue, and even the reek of gas couldn't entirely overwhelm the sickly sweat odor of its decaying flesh. Jill turned, saw that the hallway ahead was still clear. She had no choice but to run past the apartment with the gas leak and hope that its resident was too slow to try for her. "Go, now!" She took off, staying as close to the right side of the hall as she could. Feeling the effects of the gas as she pumped her arms for more speed, a soft distortion of light, a sense of dizziness, an ugly taste at the back of her throat. She ran past the cracked door, distantly relieved that it opened no wider. Suddenly remembering that the lobby was directly to the right, she rounded the corner and bam, collided with a woman, knocking her down. Jill careened off of her, hitting the stucco wall with her right shoulder hard enough that a light powder settled over them. She barely noticed, too intent on the fallen woman and on the three figures still standing in the small foyer, shifting their dumb attention to Jill. All of them were virus carriers. The woman, dressed in the tatters of a once white nightgown, gurgled incoherently and tried to sit up. One of her eyes was gone, the red, raw socket shining in the overhead light. The three others, all male, started toward Jill, moaning, their gangrenous arms raising slowly. Two of them were blocking the metal and glass wall that led into the street, her way out. Three on foot, one crawling, reaching for her legs, at least two behind her. Jill scuttled sideways toward the security door, weapon pointed at the peeling forehead at the closest, less than 2 meters away. The wall of mailboxes behind him were made of metal, but she had no choice. She could only hope that the gas fumes were weaker here. The creature lunged and Jill fired, simultaneously leaping for the door as the semi-jacketed round tore into his skull. And she felt as much as heard that the explosion, boom! A displacement of fiery air that shoved her in the direction she jumped. Hard, everything moving too fast to separate, to understand chronologically, her body aching, the door dissolving. The world blotted out in shades of strobing white. She tucked and rolled, hard asphalt biting into her shoulder, the horrific smells of fried meat and burning hair washing over her as shards of blackened glass peppered the streets. Jill scrambled to her feet, ignoring all of it as she spun around, ready to fire again as flames began to eat the remains of the Imperial. She blinked, her watering eyes widening them, trying to see past the swimming flash spots that covered everything around her. At least two of the zombies were down, probably dead, but two others stumbled around in the burning wreckage, their clothes and hair on fire. To Jill's right and rear were the remnants of a police blockade, barrier rails, and parked cars. She could hear more of the human carriers on the other side, shuffling and moaning. And there, to her left, already turning its slack and lolling head in her direction, was a single male, his ripped clothes slathered in drying blood. Jill took aim and squeezed the trigger, sending a bullet through its virus-riddled brain, walking toward it, even as it crumpled. There was a dumpster just past the dying body, and past that several uptown blocks of shopping district, now her best choice for escape. Have to head west. See if I can work around the blockades farther along. With the immediate danger past, she took a few seconds to catalog her injuries, abrasions on both knees and a bruised shoulder speckled with grit. It could have been a hell of a lot worse. Her ears rang and her vision still suffered, but those would pass soon enough. She reached the dumpster and did her best to lean over it, to see down either side of the overcast north-south street in front of her. The bin was wedged between the side wall of a trendy clothes shop and a decidedly crunched car, limiting what she could see. Jill listened for a moment, for cries of hunger or the distinctive shuffling sounds of multiple carriers, but she heard nothing. Probably wouldn't be able to hear a brass band at this point. She thought sourly and hoisted herself up. Straight across from the dumpster was a door that she thought led through a back alley, but she was more interested in what lay to the left. With any luck, a straight shot out of town. Jill jumped down, glanced to either side, and felt tendrils of real panic wrap around her brain. There were dozens of them, left and right, the closest already moving to cut her off from the dumpster. "Move, Jilly," her father's voice. Jill didn't hesitate, took 2 running steps, and threw her uninjured shoulder against the rusting door straight ahead. The door shuddered, but didn't give. "Come on," she said, unaware that she'd spoken, focusing herself on the door. "Doesn't matter how close they are. Gotta get through." She rammed the door again, the cloying scent of their rotten flesh enveloping her, and still the door held. "Focus! Do it now!" Again, the authoritative voice of her father, her first teacher. Jill gathered herself, leaned back, and felt the brush of cold fingers against the side of her neck, a rush of putrid, eager breath across her cheek. Crash! The door flew open and slammed into the bricks behind, and Jill was through, running, remembering a warehouse ahead and to the right, her pulse racing. Behind her, rising wails of disappointment, of frustrated hunger echoing through the alley that was her salvation. A door ahead. Please be open, please. Jill grabbed for the handle, pushed, and the metal door opened into silence, into a well-lit, open space. Thank God. And she saw a man standing on the main floor, just below the landing she'd stepped onto. She raised the Beretta but didn't fire, quickly assessing him before lowering it again. In spite of his torn and blood-splattered clothes, she could tell by his desperate, fearful expression that he wasn't a carrier, or at least not one that had changed over yet. Jill felt relief course through her at the sight of another person and suddenly realized just how lonely she'd been. Even having an untrained civilian with her, someone to help who could help her in turn. She smiled shakily, moving toward the steps that led down to the main floor, already making changes in her plans. They'd have to find him a weapon. She'd seen an old shotgun at the bar Jack 2 days before. 2 days before. Unloaded, but they could probably find shells and it was pretty close. And together we could probably get through one of the barricades. She only needed someone to keep watch and to help her push some of the cars out of the way. We have to get out of here, she said, focusing as much hope as she could manage. Help isn't going to be coming, at least not for a while. But between the two of us... Are you crazy? He interrupted, his fevered gaze darting around. I'm not going anywhere, lady. My own daughter's out there somewhere, lost. He trailed off, staring at the door she'd come through, as if he could see through it. Jill nodded, reminding herself that he was probably in shock. All the more reason to... Again, he cut her off, his panicky voice rising into a shout that reverberated through the open space. She's out there, and she's probably dead like the rest of them. And if I won't go out there for her, you gotta be insane to think I'm gonna go out there for you. Jill jammed the Beretta into the waist of her skirt, quickly holding up both hands, keeping her tone soothing. Hey, I understand. I'm sorry about your daughter, really I am. But if we get out of the city, we can get help. We can come back. Maybe she's hiding somewhere, and our best bet to find her is if we get some help. He backed up a step, and she could see the terror beneath his anger. She'd seen it before, the false fury that some people use to avoid being afraid, and she knew that she wasn't going to be able to get through to him. But I have to try. I know you're scared, she said softly. I am too, but I was one of the members of the Special Tactics and Rescue Service. We were trained for dangerous operations, and I truly believe that I can get us out of this. You'll be safer if you come with me. He backed up another step. Go to hell! You bitch! And he spat. He then turned and ran, stumbling across the cement floor. There was a storage trailer at the far side of the warehouse. He crawled inside, panting, as he pulled his legs in. Jill caught just a glimpse of his red and sweating face as he pulled the doors closed after him. She heard the metal clink of a lock, followed by a muffled shout that left no question as to his decision. Just go away! Leave me alone! Jill felt her own burst of anger, but knew it was useless as trying to reason with him any further. Sighing, she turned and walked back to the steps, carefully avoiding the depression that threatened to take over. She checked her watch. It was 4:30, and then sat down, going over her mental map of Uptown Raccoon. If the rest of the streets out were thoroughly overrun, she was going to have to veer back into town, try from another direction. She had 5 full magazines, 15 rounds in each, but she'd need more firepower, like a shotgun, perhaps. If she couldn't find shells, she could at least club the bastards with it. The bar Jack it is, then. She sat quietly and pressed the heels of her hands into her eyes, wondering how she would ever make it.